Ernest Shackleton sailed into the ice at the bottom of the world with 28 men, and every single one of them came home. Hold that number, because everything tonight is going to try to take it away from you. 28. Their ship was crushed, not sunk in a storm, crushed slowly over 10 months, by ice pressing in from every side until the timbers gave way and the sea came in through the wound. They lost her in a place with no land, no radio, no rescue, and no possibility of one. Nobody in the world knew where they were. Nobody was looking, and nobody would have known where to start. They were somewhere in the region of 2,000 kilometres from the nearest human being. What follows is nearly 2 years of it. 28 men living on a sheet of floating ice that are slowly breaking apart underneath them, drifting wherever the current chose to take them, for months, in the dark, with the ice cracking open under their tents at night, and men having to be pulled out of the water in the middle of it. Then 3 open boats, small boats, the kind you would put over the side to reach a beach, pushed into the worst sea on this planet. Then a desert island of black rock where 22 of them were left behind under 2 upturned boats, told to wait, with no way of knowing whether anybody was ever coming back. And then the thing that should not have worked. 6 men, 1 lifeboat 22 feet long, and 1,300 kilometres of the Southern Ocean, aiming at a target island so small that being wrong by a few degrees means sailing past it into the open Atlantic and dying there. The man navigating had 4 chances in 16 days to see the sun. 4 in 16 days. Now here is the part I want to put in front of you early, because most people have this story upside down. This expedition failed, not partly, completely. They set out to walk across Antarctica, the first crossing of the continent coast to coast on foot. It was going to be the last great prize in exploration, and the man leading it had already come closer to the South Pole than anyone alive and been beaten to it by somebody else. They never made it. Not a single man on that ship ever set foot on the continent they sailed to cross. They never got within reach of it. The expedition was over, in any sense that mattered to the newspapers before it properly began. Everything you are about to hear happens after the failure. That is the whole thing. This is not a story about achievement. It is a story about what 28 men did once the thing they came for was gone, and the only objective left was staying alive. And one more, because I would rather hand you the honest version now than let you find out later. You have probably seen the recruitment advertisement, the famous one, the one that promises bitter cold, constant danger and doubtful return. It is on posters and coffee mugs and office walls all over the world. Nobody has ever found it, not in any newspaper, not in any archive. People have gone looking seriously for a very long time, and the earliest trace of that advertisement appears decades after the expedition sailed. It is almost certainly not real. He did not need it. He got over 5,000 applications anyway. And the ship Shackleton took in there is called Endurance, a name she was given before any of this happened, which is either the luckiest coincidence in maritime history or the sort of thing that makes you sit up slightly. There is something else waiting in this one, right at the far end, and I am not going to explain it tonight because nobody has. On the last stage of it, 3 exhausted men crossed a mountain range no human being had ever crossed, without a map, without a tent, without sleeping for 36 hours. And afterwards, separately without discussing it, each of the 3 of them was certain there had been a 4th person walking with them. There was no 4th person. All 3 said it. All 3 were sure. 2 of them wrote it down, and it has never been satisfactorily explained by anyone, then or since. There are theories, and we will look at them honestly when we get there, and none of them close it. Keep that in the back of your mind. We have a long way to go before we reach that mountain. Here is the route, so you know what you're settling into. A ship going into the ice in the last summer before the world changed, with a war starting behind her. The moment the ice stops being scenery and becomes a wall, 10 months of drifting held. The night the timbers start to go, camps on a moving floe with the sea audible underneath the tent floor. 170 kilograms of gear thrown away, including the ship's Bible, because weight was survival. Boats in a sea that freezes as it breaks over you. A black island nobody wanted and everybody needed. And a lifeboat with 6 men in it, in a place where waves are measured in the height of buildings. If you came here to relax, travel back through time and go on a journey into another world, you're in the right place. If you enjoy the journey, leave a like and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing that people in completely different places can meet inside the same story for a while, so get comfortable and let's begin. August 1914, Plymouth. 28 men, 69 dogs, and a wooden ship built for ice. Let's take her south. She is loaded. She is provisioned. The dogs are already in kennels lashed along her deck, and in the exact days she is ready to leave, Europe goes to war. Shackleton assembles the crew on deck and tells them he intends to offer the ship, the stores, and every man aboard to the war effort, and that he has already wired the Admiralty. The men agree. The reply comes back in one word: proceed. Britain declares war on the 4th of August. Endurance leaves English waters on the 8th, so she is already at sea. Hold that, because everything you are about to hear happens to a ship that is already moving, and almost nothing about her is going to go according to any plan made on land. Now, who is the man standing at her stern rail watching England go, and why is he doing this at 40 years old? That answer matters more than you would expect, and I am going to give it to you at the exact moment it explains something. For now, hold one fact. He has already lost this race twice, and there is nothing left in the world for him to be first at except one thing. Nobody has ever crossed Antarctica. In one side and out the other, across the pole, on foot, around 2,900 kilometres over a landmass no human being has ever walked. That is what these 28 men are sailing toward. 27 men sailed from England. The 28th arrived by accident at sea. 3 days out of Buenos Aires, they found a 19-year-old Welshman named Perce Blackbro hidden in a locker. He had tried to sign on in port and been turned away for being too young, and a friend in the crew had hidden him aboard. Shackleton had him brought up on deck and gave him one piece of information, that if the food ran out on an expedition like this, the stowaways were eaten first. Blackbro, by the account that has come down, looked at him and said they would get a lot more meat off Shackleton than off him. Shackleton hired him. 28. Write that number down somewhere. It is the only number in this entire story that never changes, and by the end of tonight you will understand exactly how astonishing that sentence is. Now, South Georgia, and the last warning anybody gave them. South Georgia in 1914 was the centre of the southern whaling industry. Norwegian stations dug into the bays, slipways and boilers, and the smell of the work hanging over everything for kilometres, staffed by men who had worked these waters their whole lives. Endurance anchored there for a month. And what the whalers told Shackleton is the first genuinely open question in this story. They told him the ice was bad, not normal bad, the worst they could remember. Men who had spent decades sailing that exact stretch of ocean told him plainly that the pack in the Weddell Sea had come further north and closed up harder than they had ever seen it, and that if he went in, he would not get through. He waited a month for it to improve. It did not improve. And on the 5th of December 1914, Endurance sailed south into it anyway. Why? That is the question, and it has never been settled. I am going to come back to it, properly, with everything you need to weigh it. At the exact moment it stops being a curiosity and becomes the reason 28 men are in trouble. For now, only this. He never wrote down a reason that resolves it. He recorded the ice conditions matter-of-factly and pressed on. So we go in with him, and we go in knowing that the people who knew that sea best had already told him what was going to happen. Here is what pack ice actually is, because almost nobody pictures it correctly. You're probably imagining a solid white sheet. It is not that. The pack is a floating mosaic, thousands upon thousands of separate slabs, some the size of a table, some larger than a city block, all of them moving. They rotate, they collide, they grind along each other's edges. Between them are channels of open water called leads, and those leads open and close with the wind, sometimes over hours. Sailing through the pack is not sailing. It is a running negotiation. You find a lead, you follow it, it closes. You back up, ram the edge of a floe to split it, and try again. On a good day you make real distance. On a bad one you spend the whole day gaining a few 100 meters. Endurance entered the pack after 2 days at sea, which was itself a warning. That ice should not have been that far north. For 6 weeks she worked south through it. Push, ram, back up, turn, find a lead, lose it. Every day the men on deck could see open water somewhere ahead and could not always get to it. Every day the pack was a little tighter than the day before. They crossed the Antarctic Circle and kept going, around 1,000 nautical miles through the pack, which under those conditions was a serious piece of ice navigation by any standard. By mid-January 1915 they were within sight of the coast of Antarctica. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the cruelest fact in this whole story. They could see it. The land they had come to walk across was there, on the horizon, close enough that a good day's sailing would have put them ashore. They were roughly 1 day from landing. On the 19th of January 1915 the wind changed. A northerly gale pushed the whole pack in against the land, and the leads closed, all of them, and the floes packed together around the hull and stopped moving relative to each other. And Endurance stopped, not damaged, not stuck on anything, simply held, frozen into a single mass of ice that had, over a few hours, become continuous in every direction. One of the crew described her as being like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar, which is exactly right, and which is much less funny than it sounds, because an almond in chocolate does not go anywhere ever again. The first days of being beset are not alarming. This happens. Ships get held in the pack and released again when the wind swings. They tried everything reasonable. Men worked in shifts on the ice with saws and picks, trying to cut a channel to open water they could see less than 100 meters away. They could not do it. The ice was too thick and there was too much of it, and it kept freezing behind them. Within a fortnight it was clear this was not a temporary hold, and then the ice started to move. Not the ship, the ice. The entire frozen mass they were embedded in was drifting, carried by the current in the Weddell Sea, and it was taking them with it. By the 22nd of February they had drifted to their furthest point south, and then the drift reversed and began carrying them north, away from the continent, away from the plain, away from any landing. The expedition was over, they just did not say it out loud yet. On the 24th of February, Shackleton gave the order to stop keeping ship's routine and start keeping winter routine. The dogs came off and were housed on the ice in shelters the men built and called dogloos. The engines were shut down. Endurance stopped being a ship in transit and became a station. They were going to spend the winter in the ice. And this is the moment to answer the question I left open on the deck at Plymouth, because it is now the only question that matters. 28 men are frozen into a moving sheet of ice for one reason. A man was told plainly not to come in here and came in anyway. Here is why. Ernest Shackleton is 40 years old, and he has lost this race twice. In 1902 he went south with Robert Falcon Scott, got further toward the pole than anyone had, broke down physically, and was sent home early on a relief ship while the others stayed. That sat in him for years. In 1909 he went back with his own expedition and got to within about 180 kilometres of the South Pole, close enough that a hard push would have done it. And he turned around, because the food would not last the return, and he worked out correctly that reaching the pole meant not getting back from it. He was that close, and he walked away, and every man with him lived. 3 years later, a Norwegian named Roald Amundsen reached the pole. 5 weeks after that, Scott reached it too, found the Norwegian flag already standing there, and did not survive the journey back. Neither did the 4 men with him, so by 1913 the pole was gone. There was nothing left to be first at, except one thing. Nobody had crossed the continent, in one side and out the other, across the pole, on foot, around 2,900 kilometres over a landmass no human being had ever walked. That is what these 28 men are sailing toward. And the plan has a second half almost everyone forgets. A separate ship, Aurora, going round to the opposite side of Antarctica entirely, where another team will sledge inland, laying depots of food and fuel for the final stretch of a crossing they will never see begin. 2 expeditions, on opposite sides of a continent, unable to contact each other. Hold that. It is the one honest shadow across this whole story, and I will not leave it out. There is one more thing about this ship before we take her south. She had been called Polaris. Shackleton renamed her after his family motto, a Latin phrase meaning that by enduring we conquer. He named a ship after the ability to keep going. She then spent 10 months being slowly killed while doing exactly that, and 28 men carried the name off her onto the ice. So that is your answer, or as close to one as exists. A man who had turned back once, at 180 kilometres from the greatest prize on earth, and had spent 5 years being praised for a decision he privately counted as coming home with nothing. He was carrying debt and a public promise. Another season meant another year of fundraising he did not have the strength or the money for. He was 40, and the door was closing. Whatever else was in him that December, he was very probably the last man alive who would turn back a second time. And now the ice has him. May, June, July. The sun does not come up. The floe grinds and creaks constantly, and everyone gets used to the noise. And on the 1st of August, the noise changed. Ice pressure is the thing nobody can picture until it is explained, and for the next 3 months it is the only enemy in this story. The pack is millions of tons of floating ice pushed by wind and current. When those forces work against each other, the floes have nowhere left to go sideways, so they go up. Edges ride over each other and rear into ridges. Slabs a metre thick get lifted and turned on end like a book being shut. And it happens across an area the size of a country at once. A ship inside that is inside a vice with jaws moving at the speed of continents. No engine pushes back. No hull resists it indefinitely. All a ship can do is be shaped so the ice slides underneath and lifts her out of the squeeze. And here is the thing about Endurance. She was the strongest wooden ship ever built. Oak and greenheart, a bow cut from single timbers over 1 metre thick, a keel more than 2 metres deep. Norwegian builders, built for ice. But she was built for pushing through ice, not for being squeezed by it. Her hull was cut away at the stern to protect the propeller and rudder, which is excellent design for breaking ice ahead of you and catastrophic if ice ever comes at you from behind. That single decision, made in a shipyard in Norway by men who were not thinking about this, is going to kill her. On the 1st of August 1915, the floe they were frozen into broke up under pressure, and the ship was thrown around inside it, heeling over, with ice riding up against the sides. It lasted hours. She held. They got the dogs aboard fast, and the men stood on deck and watched the field around them turn into a landscape of broken ridges. And then it eased, and the ice closed again, and everything was quiet, and they went back inside. That is what the next 12 weeks are. Waiting. Then noise. Then the ship being squeezed and lifted and set down. Then quiet again. Sit inside that rhythm for a second. You are living inside a wooden object that periodically screams. No warning, no schedule. It can start at 3 in the morning. Men wrote about lying awake listening to the timbers work, trying to judge from the sound whether this one was the one. Shackleton stopped sleeping properly around this time. He walked the deck at night. Several men mention it. Through August and September the attacks came and went. She survived everyone, and everyone left her slightly worse. A beam sprung here, a seam opened there, the sternpost working loose. And on the 24th of October, the ice came in from 3 directions at once. It caught her port side and pushed. The floe on the starboard side did not give, and with nowhere to go, the hull began to bend. You could see it. That is the detail that stays with me. The men on deck could watch the deck planking of their own ship arch upward in the middle as the sides were forced together. The sternpost was torn away from the hull, and the sea came in. Everything they had went into fighting it. All 28 men, in rotation, on hand pumps, for 3 days and 3 nights, in temperatures around -20, with the pumps freezing and having to be thawed with boiling water. They kept the water down, and kept it down again, and every time the pressure came back it opened her a little further. 3 days. And on the 27th of October 1915, Ernest Shackleton stood on the deck of the ship he had named after the ability to endure, and gave the order to abandon her. Now, stop here. Because the position these men are in the moment they step off that ship is very much worse than shipwrecked. 340 kilometres from the nearest land, and that land is uninhabited. The nearest human beings are over 1,600 kilometres away on South Georgia. No radio reaches anyone. There will be no search, because no search can begin. The world assumes they are somewhere in Antarctica doing what they went to do, and when it eventually starts worrying, it will have no idea which part of a continent to look at. They have 3 lifeboats dragged off the ship, tents, sledges, dogs, and whatever food they can salvage, and they are standing on a surface that is not land. It is a raft of frozen seawater a couple of meters thick, floating on a sea nearly 4 kilometers deep, drifting, and it will eventually break up because that is what sea ice does. The floor is temporary. Every night they sleep on a floor with an expiry date. The first thing Shackleton did was to stand in front of them and tell them, in about as few words as it can be put, that the ship and the stores were gone and that they were going home, and then he did something that has been repeated so many times it has almost worn out, and it is still one of the sharpest pieces of leadership I know of. He announced that each man could keep 2 pounds of personal possessions, roughly a kilogram. Everything else stayed on the ice, and rather than argue about it, he took his own gold cigarette case and a handful of gold coins out of his pocket and threw them down into the snow in front of everybody. Then he took the ship's Bible, which had been given to the expedition by the Queen, opened it, tore out a single page from the Book of Job and the flyleaf with a handwriting on it, put those in his pocket and laid the Bible in the snow with the rest. Nobody argued about the 2 pounds after that. There were exceptions, and the exceptions tell you what he thought mattered. Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, was told to keep his banjo, 12 pounds of it, 6 times the allowance. Shackleton's reasoning was straightforward. Men who cannot sing at the end of a bad day will be a bigger problem than 12 pounds of weight. And Frank Hurley was allowed his photographs, and how that happened is one of the strangest small scenes of the whole expedition. Hurley's glass plate negatives were inside the ship, and the ship was flooded and sinking. So he went back into her, into water at freezing point, dived down through the ice-filled hold, and brought up the sealed tins, around 450 plates. Then he and Shackleton sat on the ice and went through them, and chose the 120 best. And then Hurley smashed the rest, deliberately, every remaining plate, broken on the floe, in front of him. He did it because he knew himself. He knew that if those negatives still existed somewhere behind him, he would go back for them, and going back would kill him. So he destroyed 300 photographs of a place almost nobody had ever seen, to remove the temptation. Nearly every famous image of this expedition comes from the surviving 120. The ship crushed in the ice, the ship lit up at night with flash powder against the dark, the dogs, the men on the floe. All of it exists because a man dived into a sinking ship for a box and then broke everything he could not carry. They tried at first to walk out. The plan was to march northwest toward Paulet Island, hauling 2 boats on sledges. The surface made it impossible. It was not a plain. It was a chaos of pressure ridges and soft snow and open cracks, and each boat weighed about a ton. Men sank to their knees, then to their thighs. They had to relay loads forward and come back for the rest, which means walking every kilometre 3 times. In 3 days they made about 2.5 kilometres, and the drift was carrying the whole field northwest faster than they were walking. That is the moment the arithmetic lands, and it is a horrible one. They were exhausting themselves, injuring themselves, and the floor was moving faster than they were. Some days they went to sleep further from the destination than when they woke. Shackleton stopped the march. They picked a big, solid-looking floe about 1.5 kilometres from the wreck and camped on it, and called it Ocean Camp, and waited to see where the ocean would take them. Ocean Camp was 5 tents, a galley of salvaged timber and canvas, and a stove made from the ship's ash chute. Salvage parties went back to the wreck again and again, cutting into her with chisels and bringing out timber, stores, tins, clothing. And, in one of the better decisions anybody made that month, the 3rd lifeboat, which they had originally left behind and which is going to save lives later. At one point they cut through the deck above the storerooms, and tins came floating up through the hole in the freezing water, and men fished them out with poles. Several tons came out that way. There was a routine, a hot meal, Hussey played the banjo, somebody ran a lottery on the date the ship would go down. And meanwhile Endurance lay 1.5 kilometres away on her side, being taken apart by the ice in view. Every day they could see her. That is the detail I keep coming back to. They lived in sight of their own ship dying for 3 weeks. On the 21st of November 1915, the ice let go of her. Shackleton was the one who saw it. He called out that she was going, and men ran up out of the tents to watch. The bow went down first. The stern lifted, and she went under in a few minutes, through the hole in the ice she'd been held in for 10 months, and the pack closed over the gap behind her. And then there was nothing there, just white in every direction, and no ship in it anywhere. Several of the men wrote about that evening, and none of them wrote about it well because they could not. Something had gone out of the world. Whatever else they had been able to look at her. Shackleton wrote a short line in his diary about it that I will not quote at length. He simply recorded that she had gone and that he could not write about it. 28 men now stood on floating ice with 3 boats in the middle of the Weddell Sea, with no ship on earth aware of their existence. And the number was still 28. For the next 5 weeks they sat on Ocean Camp and drifted north, and the only thing that changed was the food. Then, at the end of December, Shackleton tried to march again. You can question the decision, and people have. The first march had failed completely. The surface had not improved, but there was a reason, and it was not really about distance. Men who sit still on a piece of ice for months and watch their food go down begin to come apart, and he knew it. Marching gave them an enemy and a purpose. Even a doomed march was a thing to do in the morning. They got about 14 kilometres in a week, and then the ice ahead broke into a mess of small floes and open water that could not be walked over and could not be sailed through, and it stopped again. And it was during this that the one genuine crisis of authority on the whole expedition happened, and it involved the carpenter. Harry McNish was a Scot, a first-class shipwright, about 40, and by all accounts a difficult man with a short temper who had been in a black mood since roughly the day the ship sank. He had a point, and that is what makes it interesting. He argued that once Endurance went down, the ship's articles, the contract that made him a crew member under a captain's orders, no longer applied because there was no ship. He was not a sailor anymore. He was a man on ice being told to drag a boat, and he was not going to do it. He stopped and refused to go on. This is the sort of moment that ends expeditions. If one man successfully refuses, the whole structure goes, and there are 28 people out there with no structure at all. Shackleton read the articles aloud and made the point that the terms did not end where the ship ended, and that wages ran until every man was back in port. Whether that was legally airtight is arguable. It did not need to be. It was said with total authority in front of everybody, and it held. McNish went back to work. And here is the part I'm not going to smooth over, because it comes back at the very end. Shackleton never forgave him, and Harry McNish, who was about to build the single most important object of this entire expedition, and who is one of the 6 men on the impossible boat journey, was later denied the Polar Medal. 4 men from that crew were refused it. He was one. Hold on to that. It is one of the 2 things in this story that has never been made right. They stopped, made camp on a new floe, and named it Patience Camp. They were there for 3.5 months. And there is one thing here I will say briefly and without detail, because it is part of the record and leaving it out would be dishonest. At Patience Camp the dogs were shot. They could not be fed. There were not enough seals. The teams were no longer useful because there was nothing left to sledge over, and every dog was eating food that men needed. Shackleton ordered it, and Wild carried it out, and it broke several men badly, particularly the ones who had spent a year with those animals and had names for all of them. Mrs. Chippy, The carpenter's cat was lost at this stage too. McNish never forgave that either. I will leave it there. You do not need me to walk you through the rest of it. Patience Camp was the worst part. Not the most dangerous. The boat journeys are the most dangerous, but the worst to live through, and every account agrees. Here is why. There is nothing to do. No salvage runs, no marching, no science. 2 tasks: hunt a seal when a seal appears, and wait. The food goes down. Rations are cut, then cut again. Men are hungry all day and write about food in their diaries in obsessive detail. Long lists of meals they will eat when they get home. The weather is filthy, the tents are thin enough in places to see daylight through, and everything inside is permanently damp. And under all of it, the floor is getting smaller. That is the thing nobody could stop thinking about. The floe was melting and cracking as it drifted north into warmer water. It had been a large, solid platform when they arrived. Over 3.5 months it shrank. Cracks opened through the camp. On one occasion a crack ran directly under a tent in the night, and a man in his sleeping bag went into the water in the dark, and Shackleton, who had come out at the sound, hauled him out bodily, bag and all, before the crack closed again. The crack closed again seconds later. Think about that as a thing to know about the place you live. And there is one more thing about Patience Camp, and it is the detail that most changes how you see all of this. They could see land. Not always. But on clear days from Patience Camp, they could see the mountains of the Antarctic Peninsula and the islands off it, Joinville Island, and later others, sitting on the horizon, sometimes only 60 or 70 kilometres off. Land. Solid, real, unmoving land in sight, and utterly unreachable, because between them, and it was a broken field of floating ice, too smashed up to walk on, and too crowded to row through. Weeks of that, drifting past their own salvation at the speed the current chose, close enough to see it and no way to cross. Shackleton stood and looked at it and made the only decision available, over and over again, which was, not yet, not yet. Wait for the ice to open, because the alternative was putting 28 men into 3 open boats in a sea full of moving ice. And once you are in the boats, you cannot get out of them again. Getting that timing wrong kills everyone. By the beginning of April, the floe was down to a fragment. On the 9th of April 1916, it split directly through the camp, and the piece they were standing on was about 70 metres across. That was the end of the argument. The ice had made the decision for him. At about 1 in the afternoon on the 9th of April, they launched the 3 boats. The James Caird, 22.5 feet, the largest, named after the Scottish industrialist who had funded them. The Dudley Docker, the Stancombe Wills, the smallest and the worst. 28 men in 3 open boats in the Weddell Sea. And what happens over the next 7 days is, physically, the most punishing stretch of the entire expedition, and it is the part that almost never gets told properly because everyone rushes ahead to the famous boat journey that comes later. So we are going to do it properly. Day 1. They row and sail through leads with floes closing on both sides, and by evening they haul the boats onto a floe to sleep, and in the night that floe cracks straight through under the tents, and everybody has to be got off in the dark. Day 2. Shackleton decides they will not camp on ice again. From here on they stay in the boats, day and night. Understand what that means. 3 open boats, no shelter of any kind, men sitting on stores and ballast in freezing spray, in clothing made for dry cold and now permanently soaked, unable to lie down for 6 days and nights. Spray freezes as it lands. Ice builds on the boats and has to be chipped off constantly, or the weight sinks them. It builds on the men too. Nobody sleeps more than a few minutes at a time, and then the thirst starts, which is the detail that surprises people. They're surrounded by frozen water and cannot drink any of it. Sea ice is salt. Old floe ice loses its salt over time and can be melted, but they had launched in a hurry and had not taken enough. They ran short almost immediately. Men chewed raw seal meat for the blood in it. That is not a colourful phrase. That is what the accounts say, and it is what you do when your tongue has swollen and there is nothing else. At night the boats had to be roped together and called across constantly in the dark to check all three were still there. One night they were separated in a gale, and at dawn Shackleton could not see the Dudley Docker anywhere, and spent several hours believing he had lost 9 men. He had not. She reappeared, but that is the kind of hour it was. The navigation was Worsley's, from a boat that would not hold still, in weather that mostly hid the sun, with a sextant wedged against a thwart, with another man holding him steady. Their original target was Deception Island, well to the northwest, which had a harbour and a small store hut left for shipwrecked sailors. Wind and current made it unreachable, and Worsley worked out that they could not get there. So they changed target mid-passage, in open boats, to a place none of them wanted, Elephant Island. A lump of black rock and glacier sticking out of the Southern Ocean, uninhabited, visited by nobody, with almost no landing places at all. On the 14th of April they saw it, sheer cliffs and ice, with the sea breaking against the base of it, and no way in. They spent that night in the boats offshore in the dark in high wind, being blown along a coast they could hear. That was the worst night. Every account says so. Men had been sitting in freezing water for 5 days without sleep, and were now bailing in the dark to stay afloat within earshot of surf on rock. At dawn on the 15th of April 1916, Frank Wild took the Stancomb Wills in toward a narrow shingle beach on the north side of the island, and the first man over the side onto the stones was Perce Blackbrow, the stowaway, the 19-year-old. Shackleton had decided he should have the honour of being first ashore. What Shackleton did not know was that Blackbrow's feet were so badly frostbitten that he could not stand on them. He went over the side and went straight down into the shallows and had to be picked up and carried up the beach. They were on land, solid, unmoving, permanent land that was not going to crack in the night. 497 days since any of them had last stood on something that was not a ship or a floating piece of ice. Men fell over. Men lay down on the stones and let the gravel run through their fingers. One of them, according to more than one account, staggered around picking up pebbles and putting them in his pockets. 28 men. All of them. Still 28. And within about a day the celebration ended because Shackleton did the arithmetic and it came out badly. Elephant Island is not a rescue. Elephant Island is a better place to die. Here is what it actually is. It sits well off the shipping tracks, northeast of the Antarctic peninsula, almost entirely under glacier. No vegetation, no shelter, no wood, no fresh water that does not have to be melted, and no reason on earth for a vessel to go there. No whaler works those waters, no sealer bothers. Nobody was coming, and nobody had any reason to come, ever. Their first beach turned out to be worse than useless. A spit clearly swept by the sea in bad weather, which they could read off the debris line. So Wild took a boat along the coast and found a narrow shingle spit about 11 kilometres away, and they moved the whole camp there in a day. It is still called Point Wild. And it was honestly terrible. About 200 metres long, with a glacier behind it that regularly carved, scoured by wind off the ice, spray reaching the tents. Penguin and seal were the only food, and they were seasonal, and it was mid-April, which means winter. Shackleton did the sum, and it came out one way. Nobody is coming. The food here runs out. Winter is closing. We have to go and get help. And the nearest help was the whaling stations on South Georgia, the island they had sailed from 16 months earlier, 1,300 kilometres away. Why South Georgia? Because everything else was worse. North to the Falklands or South America meant sailing against the prevailing wind and current, which in that ocean is close to impossible in a small boat. Cape Horn was upwind. The peninsula had nobody on it. South Georgia was downwind, reachable in theory by riding the westerlies east. But it is small, and it is 1,300 kilometres away. And here is the problem that makes this the hardest piece of small boat navigation anybody has ever attempted. If you miss South Georgia, there is nothing behind it. Nothing. Sail past it and the next land is Africa, thousands of kilometres downwind, and you will be dead long before that. 6 men die, and the 22 on Elephant Island die a few months later without ever knowing why nobody came. The margin for navigational error is roughly the width of the island, so they took the James Caird, and they gave her to the carpenter. Harry McNish, the man who had refused to haul a boat on the ice, the man Shackleton would never forgive, the man who would be denied his medal, had about a week and effectively no materials. Here is what he built with. He took the mast out of the smallest boat, the Stancombe Wills, and lashed it fore and aft inside the Caird's hull to strengthen her keel and stop her breaking her back in a heavy sea. He raised her sides using planks and packing case timber salvaged from the other boats. He built a deck over most of her, a frame of sledge runners and box lids covered with canvas. The canvas was frozen solid, and it had to be thawed piece by piece over a stove before it could be worked at all, and then sewn while the men's fingers were failing. And he had no proper caulking. So he sealed the seams with a mixture of artists' oil paints from the expedition's painter, Lampwick, and seal blood. That is what stood between 6 men and the Southern Ocean. Paint, wick, and blood. They ballasted her with about 680 kilograms of shingle in bags made from cut-up blankets, plus rocks and ice. They loaded provisions for a month, deliberately only a month, and Shackleton said why out loud. If they had not reached South Georgia in a month, they were not going to. The crew was 6. Shackleton, Worsley, because there was no navigation without him. Tom Crean, an enormous, phenomenally tough Irishman who had already survived one of the hardest solo marches in polar history on a previous expedition. Timothy McCarthy, an Irish able seaman described by everyone who mentions him as relentlessly, almost irritatingly cheerful. John Vincent, a strong and difficult man. And McNish. There is an argument, made seriously, that Shackleton chose the last two partly because they were the men most likely to cause trouble on the island if he left them behind with Wild. He left Frank Wild in command of 22 men on a 200-metre spit of rock with 2 boats to turn upside down for shelter, and told him that if nothing had come by spring, he should try to take a boat to Deception Island himself. Then he told the 22 of them he would be back. On the 24th of April 1916 they got the Caird into the water, and she nearly capsized in the launching, and 2 men went into the sea before they had started, and they sailed east. The 22 men on the beach stood and watched a 22-foot boat get smaller. We're going to leave them there for a while, exactly as they were left. Keep them in the back of your mind. They cannot see what happens next, and neither can anybody else in the world. Now, the boat. 16 days. I'm going to take you through this the way it happened, because it is the centre of everything. Picture the space, 22.5 feet long, most of it decked over with canvas so low you cannot sit upright underneath. Below that, in the bow, a crawl space packed with stores and ballast. 3 men on watch, 3 off. The 3 off crawl forward on their stomachs over the shingle bags and lie in soaking reindeer skin sleeping bags in a space about the height of a coffin. The bags were rotting, and reindeer hair came out of them constantly and got into the food and into their mouths. Changing watch meant 3 men crawling out and 3 crawling in a pitching boat, in the dark, every 4 hours, for 16 days. Nobody was ever dry, not once, not for a minute. The Southern Ocean at that latitude runs the whole way round the planet without hitting land, so the swell has unlimited fetch and builds into waves measured in hundreds of meters from crest to crest. Sailors have called that band of it the Screaming 60s for as long as sailors have been going there. They crossed it in a rebuilt lifeboat in winter. Within days everything had gone wrong that could go wrong short of sinking. The canvas deck worked loose and had to be resecured constantly. Water came through the seams, through the paint and blood and wick, and 2 men were bailing at all times. And then the ice started, spray freezing onto the deck and rigging in layers, every layer making the boat heavier and higher and less stable. Twice they had to go out onto that pitching deck with an axe and hack it off lying flat, because standing was suicide and because otherwise the weight would roll her over. 2 of the 6 were in serious trouble by the halfway point. Vincent had collapsed and could no longer work. McNish, the oldest, was failing, and Worsley was navigating. Right at the top of tonight I said he had 4 chances in 16 days to see the sun. Here is exactly what that means. To find your position at sea in 1916 you need to measure the angle of the sun above the horizon at a known time, and then work it out on paper. That requires seeing the sun, seeing a clear horizon, and having a stable enough platform to hold the instrument. He had none of those things most of the time. The sky was overcast almost continuously. When the sun did appear, it appeared for seconds, so he had 2 men hold him, one gripping him around the waist while he wedged himself against a thwart, and he took the sight in whatever fragment of a second the boat was level and the sun was visible, shouting the moment to Shackleton, who held the chronometer. He got usable observations on 4 days out of 16. Everything else was dead reckoning. Course steered, speed estimated, time elapsed, drift guessed. Done on wet paper, in a boat where the ink ran and the chart had to be protected from spray. He was aiming at an island 170 kilometres long, from an approach of 1300 kilometres, and he had 4 fixed points. If he was wrong, everyone dies, including the 22 on the beach. On the 11th day the sky cleared enough for a sight, and Worsley found they were roughly halfway. And on the 14th day, in the early hours of the morning, Shackleton was at the tiller, and he looked up and saw a line of clear sky behind them, and called down to the others that it was clearing at last. And then he understood what he was actually looking at. It was not sky. It was the white crest of an enormous wave breaking, filling the entire horizon behind them, high enough that he had mistaken it for a gap in the clouds. He shouted. The wave took the boat. It picked her up and threw her forward and filled her completely, the whole hull, full of water, with 6 men in it. And for a period of seconds nobody could tell whether she was going to come up. She came up. They bailed with everything they had for a long time, and she stayed afloat. And Shackleton wrote afterwards that in 26 years at sea, he had never seen a wave like it. Here is the footnote to that night, and I only want to give it to you now. A 500-ton steamer was crossing the same waters at around the same time, bound for South Georgia. She went down in that weather with everybody aboard her. A ship 100 times the size of the James Caird did not survive the storm that the James Caird survived. On the 8th of May, at around midday, McCarthy called out, "Cliffs, ahead, through the haze, South Georgia, 16 days, 1,300 kilometres, 4 sun sights," and Frank Worsley had brought a 22-foot boat onto the coast of one small island lost in the South Atlantic. It is, by a very wide margin, the most impressive piece of small boat navigation in the recorded history of seafaring, and Worsley spent the rest of his life being modest about it. And then they could not land. That is the part people forget. They arrived in a hurricane. The wind was driving them onto a lee shore, meaning the wind was pushing them directly at the rocks, and the sea was breaking hard on the coast, and going in would have destroyed the boat and everybody in it. So they had to turn around and sail away from the island they had just spent 16 days trying to reach, and beat back out into the storm and hold themselves off the coast for 2 more days. 2 days. Exhausted, out of water, with 2 men effectively incapacitated, deliberately staying away from land they could see. At one point during those 2 days, the boat was being driven toward a reef, and a shift of wind was the only thing that took them clear of it. On the 10th of May 1916, they got into a narrow inlet called King Haakon Bay and ran the Caird up onto a small beach, and the 6 of them got out. They had made it, and they were on the wrong side of the island. All the whaling stations were on the north coast. They had landed on the south, which is uninhabited. Between the 2 sides of South Georgia is a spine of mountains and glaciers rising to nearly 3,000 metres, and nobody had ever crossed it. Not even the whalers who had worked the island for years and had no reason to go inland. The interior was unmapped. The charts showed the coastline and then blank. 2 options. Get back in a damaged boat and sail 240 kilometres around the coast, with 2 men who could not work and 4 who were finished, or walk over the top of an unmapped mountain range. He chose the mountains. They rested a few days first, turned the Caird upside down for shelter, and ate young albatross, which after 4 months of seal was apparently close to a religious experience. McNish, McCarthy and Vincent would stay. Only 3 men would go: Shackleton, Worsley, Crean. Their equipment for crossing an unmapped mountain range. No tent, no sleeping bags, no map, no mountaineering gear of any kind. 1 carpenter's adze to use as an ice axe, 15 metres of rope, 3 days of rations and biscuits in socks slung round their necks, a chronometer and a compass. And the boots, which is the detail I love most in this whole story, and it is entirely McNish's idea. They had nothing with any grip and they were about to walk on glaciers, so the carpenter took brass screws out of the James Caird, out of the boat that had just saved their lives, and drove 8 through the sole of each man's boot from the inside so the point stuck out. 16 screws per man. That was the mountaineering equipment. He weakened the boat that was their only remaining means of escape, in order to give 3 men something to grip with, because he judged correctly that the boat was finished either way. They left at 2 in the morning on the 19th of May 1916, walking by full moonlight because they could not afford to wait for dawn. The plan was 30 miles, about 48 kilometres, over unknown ground, in one push, without stopping. They tied themselves together with the rope and went up. The first day is a series of dead ends. They climb a ridge, reach the top, and look down the other side into a drop they cannot descend. So they lose all that height, traverse, and climb a different ridge, and look down, and it is impassable. 4 times. 4 ascents to a ridgeline, 4 times no way down, 4 times back to the bottom, in fog that came and went, on ground where a crevasse under snow simply takes you. By late afternoon they were on a ridge for the 5th time. with fog rising behind them, night coming, and no way down that they could see. And they could not stay. Above the snow line at that temperature, 3 men without a tent or sleeping bags who stopped moving in the dark are not alive in the morning. Shackleton looked at the slope below him, a long steep drop into fog, unknown gradient, ending in something none of them could see, and made the decision everybody remembers. He said they were going to slide. Worsley said, more or less, that they would be killed. Shackleton pointed out that staying was also being killed, and at least this way was quick. They coiled the rope into 3 rough seats and sat down on it, one behind the other, each man holding the man in front, Shackleton leading with the adze in his hands, and they let go. They went down that mountainside in fog at a speed none of them could estimate, unable to see anything in front of them for 2 or 3 minutes, which is an unbelievably long time to be doing that. And at least one of them was shouting the whole way, and they ran out onto a slope at the bottom that flattened and dumped them in deep snow. They stood up, unhurt. They had dropped somewhere between 400 and 600 meters in a few minutes, and then, by every account, they shook hands, because there was nothing else to do. They kept walking through the night. At around 5 in the morning, having come down toward the coast, they stopped to rest, and Shackleton let the other 2 sleep for a few minutes while he stayed awake, and then woke them after 5 minutes and told them they had slept half an hour, because he knew that if they went properly to sleep at that temperature they would not wake up. He lied to them to keep them alive, and told them about it afterwards. At around 6:30 in the morning on the 20th of May, they stopped and listened, and at 7 exactly they heard a steam whistle. The whaling stations blew a whistle to wake the men for the day's work, and Worsley had guessed the hour, and they had stood in the snow in the half-dark waiting to find out whether the guess was right. It was the first sound made by another human being that any of them had heard in 17 months. Worsley wrote that it was the best music he had ever heard in his life. They still had a long way down. They descended a gully with a waterfall in it, and had to lower themselves down beside falling water using the rope, and got thoroughly soaked doing it, and then they left the rope hanging there because there was no way to retrieve it. That rope is probably still somewhere on that mountain in some form. The adze was left too. And in the middle of the afternoon 3 men walked into Stromness whaling station. Now, I want you to see them the way the people there saw them. They had not washed in months. Their hair was down past their shoulders, and their beards were matted with blubber smoke and salt. Their clothes had been worn continuously for a year, and were black with grease. They stank so badly that people stepped back from them. The first people they met were 2 young boys who ran from them. Then a foreman who would not speak to them. They asked to be taken to the station manager, a Norwegian named Thorolf Sørle, who Shackleton had actually met before the expedition, and who had entertained him at that very station 16 months earlier. Searle came out and looked at the 3 of them, and by Worsley's account Searle asked who on earth they were, and the man in the middle said that his name was Shackleton. And Searle turned away, and by more than one account of it, he wept. Because everybody in the southern whaling industry had assumed for over a year that the Endurance expedition was dead. There had been no word since December 1914. There was a war on. Nobody had looked, because nobody could. That night the whalers of Stromness gathered in a room to meet them, the captains and mates and old sailors of a fleet that worked the hardest waters in the world, and an old Norwegian skipper stood up and made a short speech, and it was translated afterwards, and the substance of it was this, that these were men who worked those seas, and that they wanted to shake the hands of the men who had brought a 22-foot boat from Elephant Island to South Georgia. They all came forward and shook hands one at a time, That is the moment. Not the medal, not the newspapers. A room full of the only people on Earth qualified to understand exactly what had just been done. Standing up. Now. The fourth man. I told you at the start that this was waiting, and here it is. Sometime after they got in, Shackleton mentioned to Worsley and Crean that during the crossing he had repeatedly had the sense that there were 4 of them, not 3. He had not said anything about it at the time. He said nothing during the 36 hours, and Worsley said that he had felt exactly the same thing, and had also said nothing. And Crean agreed. Crean did not write things down, he was not a diarist, but he confirmed it to the other 2. 3 men, independently, across 36 hours of walking, each privately certain that somebody was with them. None of them mentioning it. All 3 finding out afterwards that the other 2 had it too. Shackleton put it in his book 3 years later, and the phrasing he used has become one of the most quoted lines in exploration. That on that march it often seemed to him that they were 4, not 3. Worsley wrote separately that it was the one thing about the crossing he was never able to explain. Now, let me be straight with you about where this stands, because the honest answer is more interesting than a ghost story. There is a name for it. It gets called the third man factor, and the term comes from a poem by T.S. Eliot, who said in his own notes that the image came from reading about an Antarctic expedition, almost certainly this one. And since Shackleton wrote about it, an enormous number of people have come forward with the same experience. Mountaineers near the summit, solo sailors, shipwreck survivors, people pulled out of collapsed buildings, divers, pilots, astronauts. It is a documented recurring phenomenon that appears under a very specific set of conditions: extreme physical stress, sensory monotony, exhaustion, and sustained mortal danger. The explanations offered are reasonable and none of them are complete. One is hypothermia and low blood sugar, producing hallucination, which fits the polar cases and fits nothing else, because people have reported it in deserts and in warm water. One is that under extreme load the brain manufactures an external presence as a coping mechanism, essentially generating company, because company is what keeps a person walking. There is serious neurological work behind this, including experiments in which stimulating certain regions of the brain reliably produces the sensation of somebody standing nearby. Take any of those and you still have to explain the specific fact of this case, which is 3 men, separately, silently, at the same time, over 36 hours. Nobody has explained that part. Not then, not now. So I am going to do what I said I would do at the beginning, which is leave it exactly where it is. There was no 4th person on that mountain. All 3 of them were sure there was. Both of those sentences are true and they do not fit together, and 110 years of people looking at it has not made them fit. Carry that one with you tonight and do not try to resolve it, because there are still 22 men on a beach, and they have now been waiting for 4 months. Shackleton did not rest. He got into a whaler and went back around the island the very next day for the 3 men at Peggotty Camp and picked them up, and they came in with the James Caird still afloat, and the whalers carried that boat up the beach on their shoulders rather than let anybody else touch her. And then, 3 days after walking out of a mountain range, he set out for Elephant Island. The first attempt was on the 23rd of May, in a large whaler called the Southern Sky, lent to him and crewed by volunteers. They got to within about 110 kilometres and hit a solid barrier of pack ice. She was a steel ship not built for it, and pushing in would have sunk her. He turned back, went to the Falklands and cabled London. The reply was that no suitable ship could be sent before October. October was 4 months away, in the middle of the southern winter, and he knew exactly what the food situation on that beach had been when he left it. So he stopped asking Britain. The second attempt came from Uruguay, whose government handed him a trawler, provisioned and crewed for nothing. They sailed on the 10th of June, and they got close enough to see Elephant Island on the horizon. And the pack closed, and the trawler could not take it, and he turned back again. Think about that as a thing to live through. He could see the island his men were on and could not reach it. The third attempt was a 40-year-old schooner called the Emma, chartered at Punta Arenas in Chile with money the British and Chilean residents of that town simply collected among themselves. They sailed on the 12th of July, got within about 160 kilometres, and the auxiliary engine failed and the ice closed and they were driven back. 3 failures, 3 months, every one of them ending with the same ice, and every one of those weeks, on a spit of shingle, 22 men were still there. So here is what those 22 had been doing. They were living under 2 upturned lifeboats. That was the entire structure. The boats propped on low stone walls with canvas stuffed into the gaps, and inside one space where 22 men slept, some up on the thwarts, the rest on the ground. The floor was penguin guano, frozen when they arrived and not frozen later. Blubber smoke from the stove coated everything and everyone, including their faces, permanently black. They ate penguin and seal, and when the penguins left for the winter, they ate limpets scraped off rocks and seaweed. Black Bro's frost-bitten feet turned gangrenous. The 2 doctors, Macklin and McElroy, operated in that hut with the stove built up to make the air survivable, using their last chloroform with the others holding lamps, and took the toes off his left foot. He was 19. He recovered. He lived until 1949, and Frank Wild held it together for 4.5 months. He kept a routine and kept people working. He rationed with total discipline and did not let anyone talk about the possibility that Shackleton was dead, and several of them privately thought exactly that and wrote it down. And every single morning, when the sea looked at all clear, Frank Wild rolled up his sleeping bag and told the men to get their gear packed, because the boss might come today. Every morning, for over 4 months. He was almost certainly not sure himself. That is the part that gets me. There is no reason to think he had inner certainty. He behaved as though he did, in front of 22 men, every day, for 130-odd days, and one of the survivors said afterwards that it was infectious. By the end of August, they were down to about 2 days of meat. 2 days. Meanwhile, Shackleton went to the Chilean government and asked for a 4th ship. What they gave him was a small steam tug called the Yelcho. She was 10 years old. She had no radio, no heating, no double hull, and no ice reinforcement of any kind. She was a harbour tug, and she was being sent across the Drake Passage in winter. Her captain was a Chilean naval officer named Luis Pardo, who was 33 years old, and who took the job knowing perfectly well what it was, and who reportedly left instructions about his affairs before sailing. Luis Pardo is a national figure in Chile and almost unknown outside it. He should be in this story every time it is told. They sailed on the 25th of August 1916, and this time the ice was open. That is all it was. Not skill, not a better ship. A better ship would have been anything. The pack simply happened to be open that week, and a harbour tug with no protection went straight through to Elephant Island. On the 30th of August 1916, in thick fog, the Yelcho came in toward Point Wild. On the beach it was around lunchtime. Somebody was cooking. One of the men, the expedition's artist Marston, was out on a rise, and he saw a shape through a gap in the fog. He shouted, and 22 men came out from under 2 upturned boats and ran, or in some cases limped, or in one case was carried down to the shore. Shackleton was in a boat coming in. He would not wait to get ashore. He stood up in the boat as it came in and shouted across the water, asking if they were all well. And Wild shouted back that all were safe. All were well. Shackleton said afterwards that he felt years drop off him in that moment. He would not let anybody linger. He was terrified of the ice closing again. They took the records and Hurley's photographs and almost nothing else, and left the 2 boats and the hut and everything in it exactly where it stood. Every man was aboard within an hour. 22 off that beach, 6 with him, 28. The number never moved, not once, not in 730-odd days. The Yelcho ran for Punta Arenas, and when she came in on the 3rd of September, the whole town turned out. Thousands of people, ships blowing their whistles, a Chilean tug bringing back 28 men who'd been given up for dead by everybody who had heard of them. Now, I want to tell you what happened to them, because the ending of this story is not clean, and it should not be told as though it is. They went home into the middle of the First World War. Almost every one of them served. Several were wounded. 2 who had survived the ice, Tim McCarthy, the cheerful Irish sailor from the boat journey, and Alfred Cheetham, the 3rd officer, were killed at sea within about a year of getting home. 2 men came through the Weddell Sea and the Southern Ocean and did not survive the peace they came back to. And there is the other half of the expedition, and I said I would not leave it out. The Ross Sea Party, the men on the far side of the continent, laying depots for a crossing that was never going to happen, did their job. They put the supply dumps down at enormous cost for a man who was at that moment on a floe 2,000 kilometres away with no ship. Their own vessel was blown from her moorings in a gale and drifted off with most of their equipment, leaving them stranded and short of everything. 3 of them died. They laid the depots anyway. The full route was stocked, ready for a crossing party that did not exist. That is the honest ledger of this expedition. 28 men came home from the Weddell Sea. 3 men died on the other side of Antarctica supporting them, and nobody remembers their names. And I am not going to end this without saying that they were there. Shackleton went south one more time. In 1921 he organised another expedition, and several of the old crew signed on again. Worsley, Wild, Hussey, Macklin, McElroy, Green, which tells you something about the man that no diary entry does. He got as far as South Georgia, and on the 5th of January 1922, in the early hours, anchored off Grytviken. He died of a heart attack. He was 47. His body was on its way home when his wife sent word that he should be buried in the south. So they turned around, and he was buried in the little cemetery at Grytviken, among the graves of Norwegian whalers. He is still there, and Harry McNish, the carpenter, the man who refused to haul a boat on the ice, the man who rebuilt the James Caird with paint and blood and lampwick, and put 16 screws through each of 3 pairs of boots so 3 people could cross a mountain range. He was denied the Polar Medal. 1 of 4 refused it, and the only one of the boat crew. He went back to sea, emigrated to New Zealand, and worked the Wellington docks until his body gave out. He died in poverty in 1930, sleeping in a shed on the waterfront near the end. The Seamen's Union buried him. In 2004, a bronze statue of Mrs. Chippy, the ship's cat he never forgave Shackleton for losing, was set on top of his grave. He is buried with a cat he lost in 1916. The Polar Medal has never been awarded to him. There have been campaigns. It has not happened. That is one of the two things in this story that has never been made right, and I said I would come back to it, and there it is. One last thing, and it happened almost within living memory. For over 100 years, nobody knew exactly where Endurance was. All anybody had was a position Frank Worsley had worked out with a sextant, on ice, in November 1915. And the Weddell Sea is one of the least accessible waters on the planet, choked with the same pack ice that killed her, nearly 4 kilometres deep at that point. Several expeditions tried and could not get in. In early 2022, a search vessel went in with underwater robots, in a season when the ice happened to be unusually thin, and on the 5th of March 2022, at just over 3,000 meters down, they found her, standing upright on the seabed, masts down, some damage at the bow and otherwise intact. No shipworm in water that cold, so the timbers had barely changed. You can see the paint, you can count the nails, and across her stern, in an arc, perfectly legible in the lights of a robot in the dark, the name. And beneath it, the 5-pointed star. She was found a little over 4 nautical miles from the position Frank Worsley wrote down. Worsley did that with a sextant from a floating piece of ice in 1915, and he was out by about 7 kilometres over 107 years. They found her on the 5th of March. Shackleton was buried on the 5th of March 1922. Exactly 100 years to the day. Nobody planned that. The search had been running for weeks and could have ended on any date at all. Here are the 2 honest ways of holding this story, and you do not need to pick between them tonight. The first is that endurance and leadership have rarely been demonstrated at this level, and the numbers back that up. 28 men, 700 days, a lost ship, 10 months on breaking ice, 3 open boat passages, an unmapped mountain range, and not one of them died. There is no comparable survival on that scale in polar history. Whatever else you think, that is not luck alone, and the men who were there said so for the rest of their lives. The second is that none of it needed to happen. He was told the ice was the worst in living memory by the people best placed to know. He went in anyway. Every single thing you have heard tonight, the crushing, the floes, the boats, the beach, the mountains, flows out of one decision made in a harbour in December 1914 by a man who'd already turned back once and could not do it twice. Both of those are true at the same time. The whole thing is a rescue from a hole he dug himself. And there is a third thing that is not about Shackleton at all, and it is the one I would rather you took with you. Almost everything that worked in this story was done by somebody whose name is not on the expedition. Worsley put a lifeboat on a target he could barely see, with 4 measurements. Wild held 22 men together for 4.5 months on a beach, with no evidence at all that anyone was coming. McNish built a boat out of packing cases and paint and gave away his own boat's screws. Hurley went into a sinking ship for a box of glass. Lewis Pardo took a harbour tug into the Drake Passage in winter, because a foreigner asked him to. Macklin and McElroy took a boy's toes off under an upturned boat by lamplight, and he lived to be 52. Nobody put up statues for most of that. 28 men went in, and 28 came out, and the reason is not one person. It is about 9 different people, each doing one impossible thing at exactly the point where it was needed, and none of them knowing whether it would matter. We started tonight in Plymouth with 28 men, 69 dogs and a wooden ship built to break ice. We went south past the last warning anybody gave them. We watched the leads close in a single afternoon, one day's sail from a coast they never touched. We sat in a ship that screamed for 3 months and then stopped being a ship. We lived on a floor with an expiry date and watched land go past at the speed of a current, out of reach. We went into 3 open boats for 7 days without sleep and came out on a beach nobody visits. We watched 22 people stand and look at a very small boat getting smaller. We crossed 1,300 kilometres of the worst water on the planet on 4 glimpses of the sun. And we went over a mountain range in the dark with 16 screws in our boots. Some doors in this one never shut, and forcing them now would be a lie. Why, he went into that ice after being told plainly not to, by men who had no reason to lie to him and never wrote down an answer anybody has been able to accept. What Frank Wilde actually believed, alone on the morning of day 120, when he rolled up his sleeping bag and said it again. And who was walking with 3 men on an unnamed mountain on the 20th of May 1916, in a place where there was demonstrably nobody, for 36 hours, without any of them saying a word about it until it was over? Nobody has answered that last one. There are theories. There's not an answer. If this got you through the night, a like is genuinely the only signal that reaches me. 1 tap. That is the whole thing. Subscribe if you want the next one to turn up on its own. I go hunting for whichever version of a story is still standing after you check it, and then I sit with it for a long while, quietly, at this hour, for whoever happens to be awake. And because tonight ended with a name found in the dark at 3,000 meters, tell me down below about a place near you that has a name and no explanation. A hill, a corner, a bend in a road that everybody calls something and nobody can tell you why. Say which corner of the world you're sitting in and what the clock has crawled round to. Now, let the ice have the rest of it. Let a small boat lie upside down on a beach at the wrong end of an island. Let a banjo be worth 12 pounds of somebody's allowance. Let a man roll up his sleeping bag in the morning and say it again to 22 people who are trying to believe him. Sleep well. 3 kilometres under the Weddell Sea tonight, in the dark, in water too cold for anything to eat wood. A ship is standing upright on the bottom, with her name still readable across the stern, and every single person who ever sailed in her came home.